So let's skip ahead to just some lighting thing, and I'll just talk about some general rules and observations. So the first thing you want to do if you're trying to get better at sketching, shading, lighting, and so forth is you want to draw from, I'll just do ... First thing is observation. All right, so draw from observation. When I started out in high school drawing, I remember doing lots of still life drawings, right? And not everything made sense at the time, but what you're actually doing is you're inputting into your brain just the things that you see, and you're making that connection between your technique and what you observe. So super important. Even as a designer, take some time out to draw things from real life, because it will make a difference in your final ideation sketches, even presentation sketches, and so forth. So things like, I get a lot of questions. How do I draw chrome? How do I do reflections? How do I, do shadows? All of these things. And a lot of that just relates to opening your eyes, taking a look around you, and making those connections. So the next thing is, once you draw from observation, you've put that information in your head, you can then draw from your imagination. All right, so just a quick hit point here, tip, advice for you guys. Take that and run with it if you will, and it'll make a huge difference. Okay, so a few observations about light. So I think to properly shade something, you kind of have to understand how light works. Now, if this is the ground plane, meaning, the floor or table or whatever, and a light ray, let's say we have a light bulb here, like so, and a light ray is being projected to the surface, what's going to happen is we're going to have a reflection. And this is where my technical stuff comes in. So the angle of incidence of this light is going to be equal to the angle of reflection. Super important principle to understand, because it actually impacts a lot of things. When you need to shade a cylinder, a car, all of this stuff relates to this basic idea. So this angle of incidence, and if your eyes are glazing over because you're like, oh no, this is math again. Art is math, life is math, science, it's all there. So this angle of incidence is actually going to be equal to the angle of reflection. Okay, so these two are equal. And it matters because when I have something set up like this, for example, we'll start with a plane and we'll kind of build up from there. So let's say I have in perspective some sort of plane on a surface like so, and I have light hitting this surface right here. Okay, you can imagine there is an angle of incidence here, and so we're going to get some reflection happening back into the surface. And that matters. Now we can break out the markers and pencils, and I can show you why that's important. But that matters because whenever I'm shading a surface, one of the general rules, maxims, dogmas, whatever you want to call it, mantras that I go by, is light never hits the surface perfectly in the real world. So what that means is, if I'm shading this surface, I just grabbed a random color here. My apologies if you're offended by green. But if I'm shading this with marker, I'll start dark at the top like so, even though it's a flat surface. And we can do this one of two ways. If it's shinier, we're going to get more stratification of the marker stroke than you would if it's a more matte surface. But let's just go with it here as I'm trying to create a gradient of some sort. So these lines are meant to represent, hey, there is light in the environment, not only illuminating the surface, but actually reflecting off the surface on which on which this plane rests. So then once my marker is dry, I can come in at the top again and kind of hit things here and create more of a gradient. Okay, even those lines that we skipped, we might want to fill in a couple, but the goal here being, let's create a nice gradient. All right, so that's your first lesson. Okay, angle of incidence, reflection, and light never hits a surface evenly. So never hits surface. I'm happy to send these scans as well to you guys. Surface evenly. Okay, evenly. Boom. And then incidence I is equal to R. All right. Okay, so light never hits the surface evenly. When you're applying your marker, you want to try and have some sort of gradient. The same applies if I'm using something like a pencil to shade a surface as well. or even a pen. So if I'm using this Sharpie which I have done on occasion, just quick sketching, as I'm shading the surface, I might do something like this, right? And the goal of sketching is not to photorealistically recreate what's in real life, but rather create symbols. So this whole thing is a symbol. There's a lot of information packed in there. I'm able to suss out the lighting source, perhaps a bit of the materiality of this thing, the reflectivity, and so forth. Because if I shade this in a different way, for example, I'm able to communicate something of a different texture. This would take forever to do, so I'm not going to do it on the stream here. But if I were to shade and hatch a surface, say in this fashion, now we have a completely different effect, but the idea is the same, that from top to bottom, I'm trying to create a value system of a gradient, right? Because of that whole idea that light never hits this surface evenly. Okay, so that's your first thing. So what happens when you have a curved surface? Okay, something like this. Maybe it's a section of something curved, like a cylinder or whatever. All right, and this is resting on a surface. Typically, you'll see this set up, outdoors. If you look at things like motorcycle pipes or whatever, you get this effect happening that I'm about to talk about, I should say. So if we just flip our view here and look at this from a side view, right? So same thing. We've got the ground plane here. Okay, and let's say I'm observing the scene. This is my eye. I'm observing the scene this way. Now, the sun or light source, whether it's artificial or otherwise, is up here. So I'm going to have light rays hitting the object, of course, but I'm also going to have light rays hitting the ground. And so these light rays hitting the ground are going to illuminate the underside of this object. Now, if we zoom in a little bit closer to this curve, we'll revisit this page in just a sec, but if I zoom into this curve, and let's just complete the curve here, or actually let's think about it another way. Let's take this that looks like a cylinder on its side, or part of a cylinder or some curved object, and let's rotate it vertically, and now we're looking at it this way. If you guys aren't following, or if you have any questions, feel free to ask, by the way. I'm not watching the chat, so Scott, if anyone mentioned something, let me know. Let me actually pull that up. Okay, I'll pull it up. Okay, so the video is probably, I just saw the comment. The video is a little choppy. My apologies. Probably because my kids are watching stuff while I stream here. Okay, so if my light source is off to the side, for example, okay, I'm going to have light rays being projected but I'm observing from this perspective. Now, as these light rays interact with this curvilinear object, okay, we're going to get something interesting happening. So right where the light passes this point of tangency, all of a sudden, if this were sitting on a surface, for example, all of a sudden this is all shadowed, right? Okay, in its basic presentation. Same thing on the backside. You can imagine the backside of this whole thing would be in shadow. Okay. At a certain point, with the reflections that you create with this whole idea of incidence and reflection, okay, now you're dealing with a curved surface. So if you're dealing with a curved surface, you have to pay attention to these incident points that are tangent, okay? And these are going to change as you're moving around the circle. If you've done any 3D modeling, you might have heard of things like surface normals and so forth. That axis of reflection or plane of reflection is the point normal to that surface. So I'm going to have lines like this poking off the surface, all right? And hopefully this blows your mind a little bit, or at least helps make sense of all of this. Okay, so you may have heard of the idea of a shadow core. So what is a shadow core? Your professor may have told you, you think, oh, okay, it's just like this blended area, but why does that happen? It happens because you do get points on this cylinder where, as the light rays are incident to this curve on the cylinder, they start to reflect away from you, okay? And if light's reflecting away or passing by you, you're gonna get shadow. At certain points, right, where there's more of a reflection, remember, you're looking at this point, if you're looking at this cylinder from different points, it's gonna have a different appearance if the light is fixed. So where you have, let me think about this. So right here is probably where you would have some intensity of light, right? So you're going to have, if I'm looking at this cylinder, this is really where my highlight is going to be. Okay? Because most of those tangent incident plane axis points are projecting the light back to me. Here, the light's being projected away from me, but I'm going to have essentially a secondary highlight at this point. Now, since this is an environment, like I said, with the plane, and when we sketch a real thing, this will all make sense, we also have light rays hitting the ground and reflecting up. So this wouldn't entirely be in shadow. Okay, you're going to have secondary light. Usually less intense than our primary light, so we get a little bit of a shadow and then some reflected light. You're going to get a secondary highlight and then a shadow core, and possibly, you know, if there's another light in the scene, you're going to possibly get, you know, some tertiary light source reflecting on the back. Not that you'd see that, but just something to be aware of, that it's not as simple as having one light source and shading. Because if you were to do that, everything would just look flat and boring and weird and unrealistic. Okay, so let's apply this to some real stuff. So we just did a cylinder from the side view. Here we had our curve that I said we'd revisit. So what does this mean? I'll just take this red marker and do it. So if I'm looking at this and I have my light from the top, similar to the setup that I had with that cylinder, but from the side, like I said, you're going to get some sort of highlight here next to some shadow. And as we recede away, we're going to get another highlight and then shadow. Okay? Something like this. And it looks weird. This is probably where I need like another marker. Let me see if I can. This should work. I thought this said Corona pink for a second. I was like, oh, traumatized. So secondary highlight right there, and then our primary highlight. Depending on the reflectivity or shininess, polish of the surface, you're going to get either more intense at this point or less intense, just depending on how rough that surface is. If you want to zoom in on surface roughness, and what I mean is if there are undulations in the surface, right, it's not as simple as, oh, light's hitting like so and reflecting. It's now light's hitting here and reflecting this way, or it's hitting here and reflecting back, and so you don't get as much light coming back to you. All right. Okay, so we did flat surface, which we can apply to a cube. Curve, we can apply that to a cylinder. And then let's do a sphere as another primitive. We warmed up with a sphere. Do we need to cover shadows, or are you guys good on shadow stuff? Okay, I'll do quick shadows as well. All right, so let's say we have a sphere, kind of like I talked about in my warm-up. If you were to cut the sphere into segments, like so, right? Really, it's kind of like if you had a cylinder, right? If it's, well, I guess it would be this way. It's kind of like if you had a cylinder and you took these points on the top of the cylinder and just pinched it, okay, toward the center. That's how I like to think about a sphere. It's like taking these two, the top and bottom, pinching it in, pushing it, and so we'll shade this cylinder and apply that to the sphere in just a sec. All right, so kind of like our example, we're gonna have shadow core like so. Notice how when I'm applying the marker, it's deliberate, confident, not going too slow. So shadow core, reflected light. Okay, that's kind of how I like to set it up. And then we have a blend across the middle to a highlight. And right next to the highlight, we also have our reflected light. Let's see, it says the R1. So I'm going to go like that because I can go a little darker with this marker to get my shadow core and blend across. Probably shouldn't have shaded that in as much, but the idea is if this is more of a matte surface, here's our highlight, here's our shadow core right there. This is reflected light, and we also have reflected light here as well. Now if we take this and apply it to this sphere, what you're going to end up having is something like this. So this shadow core, right, normally would be about this position. So instead of a straight line, you end up with a curve. And this curve depends on how the light is positioned relative to the sphere. But I like to start out with that shadow core and then create the rest of the blend around. Your highlight's going to be somewhat of a round spot that happens depending on the surface finish, intensity of light, and so forth. It'll have a certain appearance in terms of size, but I like to kind of apply the marker in a curved fashion, something like that. Okay. When you are working with marker, you do want to go lightest lights to darkest darks, so that just gives you the ability to leave a little bit of room for pushing your contrast values and so forth darker if you need to. In fact, I'll probably break out my Copic markers. These are just some cheap markers I found online because I know I can go a little bit darker here, and I know exactly which marker I want to use for that. Oh, actually, I did find one that might work here. Yeah, this works. So here I can push the contrast value of this shadow core. Okay. Now, remember I mentioned drawing from observation. One of the things you'll observe if you take a minute to look around the room you're in or where you're at is that when you have a change in direction of a surface, you have contrast. Okay, so if you look at where two walls meet in the room, I see a couple of your screens. I can see in Scott's background as well. You're going to have a change in the value, rather, and set up some contrast between those two objects. Now, if you have a red, light enough, it's easy to fill in that highlight spot, but we'll leave it just bright for now. You can also take some pencil and fill that in. Let me see. Yeah, maybe this will work. So a more matte cylinder, or a more matte sphere rather, might look something like that. And then from that point we just filled in, we can kind of finish out our blend. All right, something like that. Now, let's see. Let's do a quick cube, and we'll talk about shadow, and then we'll do some quick orthographic and perspective real product stuff. Okay. So let's say we have a cube here, and from the side view, well, this is a bad place to put it. Let's do it here. So from the side view, we have some box, and we have a light. Okay, so this light, if it's a point light, it's going to cast light rays that are going to pass through the edges of this cube. Think of it that way. It's a lot simpler to do a natural light shadow than it is, or yes, natural light shadow, meaning sunlight, than it is to do artificial light. So I'm going to focus on a natural light shadow. Now with a natural light shadow, let's say this is artificial light. With a natural light shadow, what actually happens is the light rays are parallel. Or you can think of them parallel. They're not really parallel, but think of them as parallel. And what that means is through the edges of this object, I'm going to go ahead and draw through, meaning show the whole skeleton of this cube. And let's pick a fun color here, like this orange. And there are a couple things you want to pay attention to. All right, so this here just represents me being able to pick where the light is in relation to the object. Okay, so there's two things we need to do. Where is the sun or this light source in relation to the cube? It could be here, it could be here, it could be here, behind the object, in front, maybe a little bit to the back. I'm going to pick right about, maybe right about there. Okay, so if I pick there, the next thing I need to do is pick how high up. Okay, now I could go off the page, and just kind of imagine here, but just for argument's sake, let's pick, and this is going to be a really long shadow, but the lower, and I know it's going to be long because the lower the light is, the further out the projection is going to be. But we can go through these lines, all right? Now, rather than, or through these corners, sorry. Rather than draw each line through this projection, what I'm actually going to do is assume the light rays are parallel, because this is the sun, in case you're wondering. Obviously, I failed art as a kid. That is the sun, because the sun is yellow. We all know that, the yellow crayon. I feel like some people are yellow crayon people, and some people are like orange crayon for the sun. But anyhow, I digress. So parallel light ray, and now I can project through all these points, these corners. Because of my experience, I know I don't need to mess with this one, but I'll just show you anyways. We'll project through that corner. Now what you want to do after you get through those top corners is actually move down now and look at the bottom corners here. And from the bottom, now, again, in relation to where the sun is, just reasonably estimate, okay, based on that position. Remember, if the sun is, here, I'm going to have my shadow lines going this way. So I'm just saying it's generally this direction. Maybe it's a little bit off, but the principle works. And so now at these intersection points, let's see, one right there. No, right there, sorry. 2, 3, and then like I said, this one doesn't matter because it's going to fall within the shadow 4. But notice what this shape looks like right here. So this shape looks an awful lot like the top shape. So essentially you're kind of taking the top of the object, projecting it down. And this is the side or edge of that cube. Okay, and once you establish that pattern and you understand what's happening, it's really easy to then go, oh, I have an object. And let's see, I've got a cube or something here, very simple perspective. And I can just draw, and I know that's a reasonable estimation of a shadow. Okay, so a lot of the underpinnings and understanding all this stuff, it really translates into being able to sketch quickly and move quickly. Now, what do you do when you have something like a cylinder? Like this. Okay, we picked from the corners for our initial shadow, right? But in this case, what I actually need to do is try and collect some data. Right, so I've divided the top of my cylinder here into points, and I can project down like so, in the back and the front. And similar to the cube, what I then do is draw parallel lines through all these points. Again, I know what the shape looks like, so it's really hard for me to not be tempted to jump ahead. And then from each of these corners, okay, so this one's going to be a little hard to match up. So we got one here, here, and then let's draw first. So that's our first point. And we'll just keep all these lines parallel. We'll figure out the intersections in just a sec. And I'll just sketch these on the backside because, again, I know these aren't going to really impact what I'm doing so much. Well, maybe I'll just show you anyways. All right, so we got these lines being projected across. And so here, one from this point to here, we've got a point here. Let's see, over, we got a point there. From here over, we have a point here. So what you're actually sketching, I'll just skip ahead, is this ellipse projected down. Now notice what's interesting about these two is the ellipse on the top. Let's say this is a 30-degree ellipse. This one's actually probably more like a 40-degree ellipse or so. And so these principles of perspective apply to shadows as well. Okay, this is lower, so I'm seeing more of the shape than I would if it were at the top, much like a coffee cup or something like that. That also applies. So when I do shadows for things like cylinders, oftentimes I'll just take the shape of that bottom ellipse, shift it over, and then just fill it in like that, and there's my shadow. Okay, so because you understand the principle, you can take the shortcut to showing that thing, in this case the shadow, right? I don't have to project all these points down and shade everything in. This is mostly for your benefit. Okay, And then the last one we'll do, because a cone's pretty easy to figure out. Here's a sphere. With the sphere, however, what you want to do is, again, think of where your light source is. And if the light is being projected, like so, parallel rays, okay, much like our cylinder, if you remember that example. Let's see if I can pull this up. That's a lot of paper. Let's see. Okay, so much like this round example, there's a certain point where light's going to pass, like, let's assume this is a sphere now. Light's going to pass this point, and this point in perspective is actually a circle. So everything past this point would be responsible for the shadow. So in other words, let's say I drew this slightly off axis. I can just pick points all along this circle, okay? Project down like so, all the way down. This is completely not accurate, by the way. And if I'm thinking of it in terms of, okay, what's this shape where the light is passing all these points? It's a circle, and a circle in perspective is an ellipse, okay? So if I have a flat plane here, what I'm going to end up happening, you know, you could project down all the way across all these points. You could project down and then over, but what you're going to end up with is something like this, okay, which is just a very tight ellipse, low degree ellipse in this case. Now, because a sphere in perspective is a sphere, is a circle, right? No matter where I draw it, it's going to look like a circle. My shadow is accurate even if I do it like that, or if I do it like that, or if I do it like that. It all depends on the orientation of the light related to that sphere. Now, if this is a complete mess and you're like, what the heck is he talking about? I'm happy to do a follow-up YouTube video where I can go into this in depth, throw it in Illustrator, show all the points, planes, and all of that stuff. But hopefully this is enough to help you understand a little bit about lighting curved surfaces and also flat surfaces. All right, so let's start basic and move really quickly into doing some sort of product. Feel free to drop some ideas in the chat of what you'd like to see me draw and add some shading to. We have plenty of time, so don't worry. I work quickly. So let's do a cube. Well, I'm not gonna say it's a cube because the proportion's likely off. When you say a cube, you're like throwing down and you're saying, okay, proportionally, I'm gonna nail this. But if you just say a box, it gives you a little wiggle room. So here's a box, and let's do a cylinder, like so. And yeah, that should be enough for now. Okay, so let me grab my grays, my reliable grays here. And if I have hundreds of markers, but you guys don't, and you probably don't need hundreds of markers. So if you are gonna buy markers, what you really wanna do is just have a good value spread. Okay, Copics are nice because the colors are consistent and the system makes sense. So these are C2, C4, and C6, okay? So C2, this is a cool gray 2. Cool gray 4 is 2 steps in value away from my C2, and C6 is 2 steps in value away from my C4. So you want about a 20 to 30% spread between your markers because the in-between is really easy. Now, like I said, you want to start lightest lights to darkest darks. So I'm going to start on the top here, the top surface, and we'll shade. Now, as I mentioned, light doesn't hit a surface completely evenly. So on the top as well, I'm actually going to project a gradient forward from the back. So let's start by shading in the back, like so. I've angled the tip of the marker so that I can start and stop in the same, or rather on the line. And again, notice how I'm holding the tool. And in fact, you can see it here where I can see what I'm drawing as opposed to guessing what I'm doing, okay? So get in the habit of holding your marker back a little bit further. All right, so I've shaded that top surface in. I'm gonna let my marker chill for a minute because we're gonna hit that again. Now, if this is the top and this is and these are the sides, and my light source is somewhere here, which of these two surfaces is going to be darker? Is it going to be this one, or is it going to be the one? Okay, yeah, this one's going to be this one. Well, actually, this one's going to be darker if my light source is to the side. Sorry, I think you were pointing and then the zoom things flipped, so you're probably right. Anyhow, so with my 40% or C4, I can now shade in this face. And like I said, depending on how reflective the surface is, we're going to have some banding or stratification that you put in with the marker. Now, like I said, you want to work lightest lights to your darkest darks, and basically that just means use your lightest marker first. So even on this far side, I'm going to use this 40% marker that's kind of drying up a little bit. Now that the top's dried a little bit, I do want to introduce some contrast from back to front. Okay, so away from the light, I can now take my 20% scrub and create a very subtle gradient from back to front. Now, here's where I'm going to apply that principle that I observed in real life. Wherever I have a change in surface direction, okay, I'm going to have a difference in contrast value. So value 1, and this will be value 2, okay? And not only that, but toward the top, even if I did this with pen, I would do something like this. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to achieve, is some decent contrast right where we're changing direction in these two surfaces. So here on the front, I can take this 40%, now that it's dried a little bit on the paper, and hit it again and start to create that gradient. Now, much like I said, if this is resting on a table or surface or what have you, you're going to get some reflected light. So my goal here is to create some contrast between these two. I'm going to put this marker to the side because I need to refill it. But I'm going to get that contrast happening toward that top edge. Now, what do you do on this far side? Since it's super dark, I'm just going to take this C6. You might be tempted to do an angle. That's fine. You could do that. But since all my shading is very oriented to the shape of the side of the surface, I'm just going to keep that consistent. But the same thing applies. Okay, just applying a gradient down. It may stop about here. The reason for that is I'm now going to take my 40% marker. Sometimes you have to work a little back and forth. So I'll take this 40%. Okay, and help my gradient, and now come back with the 60. Start to shade this in down like so. All right, to finish off that blend, back to the 40, right where we left it, just like that. Okay, so now we have a 3-value system. We have highlight, midtone, shadow, all with reflected light. Once again, light hits the surface, reflects into the object. Because this is in closer proximity to the ground, based on where we're looking, we're going to get a lighter values toward the bottom and that gradation. Same thing with this edge. It's closer to the light source, so it's lighter. This is further away, so it's a little bit darker. There are a couple interesting things you can do as well. So I forget what year students you guys are. Sophomores, juniors, okay, sophomores. So another interesting thing that can happen here, just to finish this off, let's use our Sharpie, add some line weight, like so. All right, so the line weight, and if this were on some sort of plane, okay, like let's say this top surface for wood or something like that. I just want to show you something to consider or think about. So if this top surface is something like wood, just shade this in real quick. And let's see, it's E13, so let's grab, I'll just do this 25. Hopefully this will work. So let's say this is wood. We have some nice texture in here. All right. something like that. So now we're sitting on a nice wood table here. What you can do, let me grab my pencils. Ah, there they are. But what you can do is take something like a brown pencil, brown, orangish, something that has a warm tone similar to the marker for the table here. Or if you have a light enough marker, you can also use that, which I may have, but I'll use the pencil. And now this reflected light is actually going to be a bit of the color of the table, okay? So that's just gonna help, again, if you pay attention to what you observe in real life. Now we have some lighting in this cube that is representative of that reflective light. The other thing worth considering as well is, okay, is the tabletop here reflective? And if it is reflective, which I haven't really covered in our presentation today, but you might get a little bit of a reflection of this cube in the table surface. Okay. Not only that, but now we have to think about the shadow. Okay. So what does that look like? I'm just going to take a gray marker, maybe something like a warm gray, and show you what that looks like. So now shading over all of this, okay, on the back side here, we're going to end up with a shadow. All right. So all these things really quickly can take a sketch and just make it that much more, make it pop that much more. And I haven't even gotten to the other tricks you can use. So let's just touch on the cylinder here. Maybe we'll do something like a flashlight or something. I got a question. Can I demonstrate how to shade correctly with a minimal amount of marker and pen use? Yes. So let's do that on the cylinder, in fact. Perfect timing for that question. So this is what I call an abbreviated marker application. So what I like to do in this case, if it's abbreviated, is actually just focus on a couple of things, the shadow core and a highlight, okay? Because those are the things that really pop in the case of a cylinder. I can also show you on a flat surface, but I may just hit something like this, shadow core, like so, and then a couple lines for your highlight, something like that. And then a bit counterintuitive here and a little bit of a cheat. Sometimes you do cheat when you sketch, but I really, really, really want these two edges to appear to be changing direction. And so in real life, again, I'm going to take that principle of contrast where a surface changes direction and apply that to the top, like so. If all I had was one marker, it's probably about as much as I do, and then outline the object. And you could throw a couple black lines on as well, just to help with that value change, like so, okay? And then just throw in a quick shadow. All right, so something like that, maybe just a background to kind of help that pop. All right, so hopefully that answers your question. Really the emphasis being on, like I said, the zoom view is trippy, shadow core and highlight, and also this value contrast, which you can see, let's see there and there as well. We've got reflection. Here we've got reflected light, and we also have shadow. Okay, so all those elements come together when you're shading something.